Welcome back to Bookkast, where we conquer bestsellers in minutes.
That's right.
And today we're diving into Confronting the Presidents by Bill O'Reilly.
Absolutely.
It promises a no-holds-barred look at presidential history.
The good, the bad, and everything in between.
So, should be an interesting one. You know, right off the bat, it's pretty fascinating. O'Reilly throws in this detail about George Washington.
Okay.
Apparently, he fought against giving his own mother a pension, even though she claimed, she was having some money troubles.
Really?
Kind of makes you think twice about, the man behind the myth.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark contrast to, the image we have of Washington as this, selfless leader. I wonder if it was a decision about his image, Like he didn't want to look like he was playing favorites. Or maybe, maybe it was even like a strategic move, like setting up boundaries between his personal life and what he had to do as president.
It's interesting, though, right? Because it really sets the stage for this recurring theme that we see throughout the whole book.
What's that?
That balance between their personal choices and the huge weight of the presidency.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
And speaking of challenges, the Whiskey Rebellion during his presidency, that wasn't just, a bunch of farmers, upset about taxes, was it?
No, not at all. It was a real test for the, newly formed government.
Yeah.
Could they actually enforce the laws? Could they keep things in order?
Right.
Washington put down the rebellion, and that showed everybody, okay, the federal government means business. They're not going to just sit back and let people ignore the law.
And that kind of set a precedent, didn't it?
It did. I mean, think about it. That same idea, the government's authority, it kept coming up. Again and again. You see it in later challenges, even leading up to the Civil War. It's like this thread running through history.
That's a really interesting connection. I hadn't thought about it that way before.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like even these small events, they could have such a lasting impact.
Absolutely. It's the butterfly effect in action. Speaking of shifting gears a little bit, I was surprised by, how much John Adams loved hard cider.
Oh, yeah. A whole gill before breakfast every day. That's hardcore.
I mean, we can't judge them by today's standards, right? It's a different time.
Yeah, of course.
Back then, hard cider, that was the drink. The water wasn't always so clean, so cider, that was the way to go.
That makes sense. So maybe not so excessive for the time.
Yeah, and, people's attitudes towards drinking were different back then, too.
Right.
Like how we think about, like a glass of wine with dinner today. It was more accepted then.
Yeah, for sure. It makes you wonder, what other presidential habits would seem strange today? Speaking of interesting habits, this story about Dolly Madison.
Oh, yeah. What about her?
I mean, with the White House burning down around her, she's worried about saving a portrait of George Washington and planning a dinner party for the British.
Wait, what? A dinner party?
Yeah, for the British officers, the ones who were invading.
Wow.
Talk about being cool under pressure. I mean, was she just that poised? Or was there, something else going on?
I mean, she was definitely known for her grace under pressure. But, I think it's more than that.
What do you mean?
Saving that portrait. That wasn't just about art. It was a message.
Okay.
Like, hey, we might be losing this battle, but we're not giving up.
Huh, I see.
And the dinner party, as strange as it sounds, it was probably strategic, too.
Okay, how so?
She's keeping up appearances, maintaining some kind of normalcy.
Right.
Maybe even, trying to assert some control in a chaotic situation.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at it. It shows how, especially during a crisis, actions can have so many different meanings. But things weren't always so polite in the White House, right? I mean, the rivalry between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, it's intense.
Oh, yeah. That was a blood feud.
Jackson actually blamed Adams for his wife's death.
Seriously?
Yeah, and refused to help him during the transition. That's pretty harsh. We don't see that kind of personal animosity in politics so much today, do we?
Well, back then, politics was very personal and brutal. It wasn't just about policy, It was about pride and grudges and years of, political maneuvering.
I guess that makes sense.
It shows how even at the highest levels, emotions can drive those political rivalries.
Yes. It makes you realize that decisions aren't always based on logic and reason. And of course, we can't talk about Jackson without mentioning, his whole legacy with Native Americans. The Trail of Tears, that's a dark chapter in American history.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the complexities of his whole presidency.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, he's the champion of the common man, right? But then his policies on Indian removal, they caused so much suffering, so much displacement. It's a reminder that even those presidents who say they're for democracy, they can still do things that are unjust.
Yeah, it's something to think about for sure. As we, keep moving through the presidents, it's clear that slavery just becomes this huge issue. O'Reilly brings up Nat Turner's rebellion and the growing abolitionist movement. How did those things change the political landscape in the years leading up to the Civil War?
Well, Nat Turner's rebellion, even though it failed, it really shook the South.
How so?
I mean, it made those fears of slave uprisings so much worse. It kind of pushed people further apart, made those pro-slavery views even stronger. And the abolitionists, at first they were just a small group, right? But they were getting stronger.
Yeah.
They were challenging the whole system, the South's economy, their way of life.
And that all just built up to the Civil War, didn't it?
It did. It's like, you ignore these problems for too long and they just keep growing until, boom, you have this huge conflict.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of how, these unresolved issues, they can really fester. But before we get too deep into those dark times, I wanted to ask you about something a little lighter.
Sure. What is it?
Did you know that the phrase okay started during Martin Van Buren's presidency?
Okay. Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine, right? It's like so common now.
It's everywhere. I never would have guessed it had a political origin.
Well, it came from his campaign slogan. It caught on, and boom, everyone's saying okay.
Wow, the power of a catchy phrase. That's fascinating how these things become part of our everyday language.
Yeah, it really is. On a less fortunate note, we have William Henry Harrison. He gives this super long inaugural address.
How long are we talking?
Longest in history. In the pouring rain.
Oh, no.
Without a coat or hat.
Yeah.
And then he dies a month later.
No way. Really?
What a way to go. It makes you think about how fragile life is, even for, the president.
Yeah, it definitely puts things in perspective. And it shows, how leadership, especially back then, was really unpredictable. You never knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, for sure. So we've gone from Washington's image all the way to Harrison's unfortunate demise. And that's just the beginning of this book.
It's amazing how these early presidents, even though they seem so far away in time, they still have so much to tell us.
Yeah.
It's like their dilemmas, the choices they made, they're all still relevant today.
Absolutely. They give us a glimpse into how leadership works, how America has evolved. It's fascinating.
Totally. We can learn so much from their successes and their failures. It's true. It's like looking in a mirror sometimes, These early presidents, they faced problems that we still struggle with today, like executive power, for instance.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Washington, he took that strong stance during the Whiskey Rebellion, right?
Right.
And then Jackson, he wasn't afraid to use his veto power.
Yeah.
They were defining what it meant to be president, how much power they actually had. And that debate, it's still going on, even today.
It makes you wonder how much of what we see now with, our modern presidents, how much of that comes from those early decisions? Are they just building on what those guys did, or are they, pushing the limits?
It's a good question. And things get even trickier when we get to the mid-1800s. The whole issue of slavery, it just explodes.
Yeah.
And you can't talk about that time without mentioning people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. They were so brave, speaking out against slavery, risking their lives to fight for freedom.
Their voices were so important, right? They really helped change how people thought about slavery.
Absolutely. They challenged the nation's conscience. And then, of course, you have the Civil War. I mean, that changed everything.
Yeah. A defining moment in our history. And right in the middle of it all, you've got Lincoln and then Andrew Johnson, both dealing with, the war and then trying to put the country back together.
Yeah, it was a period of, total upheaval. I mean, Lincoln, he held the Union together. The Emancipation Proclamation, that was huge. It changed the course of the war, made it about ending slavery.
Right.
But then reconstructing the South, that was a whole other battle.
What happened?
Well, Johnson, he pardoned a lot of those Confederate leaders. A lot of people, they thought he was too easy on the South.
Yeah.
And the whole issue of racial justice, it wasn't really addressed. Reconstruction, it failed in a lot of ways.
It's a good reminder that even after a war ends, the healing, the rebuilding, it takes a long time. So we move into the late 1800s. The country's changing so fast. Industry's booming. People are moving west. Yeah. What were the presidents dealing with then?
Well, you've got guys like Grant, Hayes, Garfield. They were dealing with corruption, economic inequality, and, the fight for civil rights. It was still going on. It was a time of, huge opportunity, but also a lot of uncertainty. The country was trying to figure out, what it wanted to be in this new era.
It's funny how certain themes just keep coming up again and again, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like the role of government, the balance of power, the fight for justice. Like, we're always wrestling with those same questions. O'Reilly also throws in these, like, little fun facts about the presidents. Like, Chester A. Arthur.
What about him?
Apparently he had like 80 pairs of pants.
80? Really?
The man loved his fashion. It's kind of cool, right? It shows you that these guys weren't just, these stiff figures in history books. They were real people with their own, quirks and passions.
It's true. And sometimes those little details, they can tell you a lot. Like with Arthur, maybe all those fancy clothes, it was his way of like projecting an image.
Interesting.
Maybe he wanted to seem sophisticated, distance himself from all the scandals that were happening before.
Yeah, that makes sense. Image is important, even for a president. Speaking of image, what about Grover Cleveland's secret surgery?
What? He had a secret surgery?
While he was in office. Can you imagine that today?
Wow, that's crazy.
I mean, he kept it totally under wraps.
Why would he do that?
I guess back then, privacy was different. The media wasn't all over everything.
Right. But it does make you think, right?
About what?
About how much the public needs to know, especially when it comes to the president's health.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, where's the line between personal privacy and, the public's right to know?
It's a debate that's still going on today. So we're moving into the 20th century. The U.S. is becoming a global power. The presidency is even more important now. Guys like Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, they're dealing with a whole new set of challenges.
Yeah, the world was changing so fast. What were some of the big issues they faced?
Well, Roosevelt, he was all about the progressive era.
What was that?
It was this whole movement to fix the problems caused by, industrialization, inequality, corruption, all that stuff. And Roosevelt, he wasn't afraid to use the government to make things better.
Right.
He busted up monopolies, protected the environment. He was a big personality.
It was, wasn't he?
Speak softly and carry a big stick. That was him.
Yeah. What about Taft? He doesn't get as much attention, does he?
No, he doesn't. But he was a solid president. He did a lot of good work, especially with antitrust laws and the courts. He was more of a legal scholar, more cautious than Roosevelt. But he got things done.
It shows how different presidents can have different styles, right?
Oh, totally. And then boom, World War I hits.
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, he's in charge. The whole world's at war, and the U.S. gets dragged into it.
What was his approach?
Well, at first, he wanted to stay neutral, but that didn't last.
Right.
And after the war, he came up with the 14 points.
What were those?
It was his plan for peace, He wanted to create a world where countries would work together, not fight.
That's a pretty ambitious goal.
It was, and it didn't really work out the way he hoped.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of these grand plans, they face a lot of challenges when it comes to actually putting them into practice. So what happened after the war?
Well, the Roaring '20s, right. Jazz, flappers, the economy was booming.
But it didn't last, did it?
No. Underneath all that, there were these problems brewing.
Like what?
Economic inequality, social unrest, and then bam, the Great Depression hits.
Yeah, a huge turning point. What were presidents like Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover doing during all this?
Well, Harding, his presidency was full of scandals. Coolidge, he was all about hands-off government, let the economy run wild.
Right.
And Hoover, he couldn't handle the Depression. He tried, but nothing seemed to work. It was a disaster. People were suffering, losing their jobs, their homes. It was a really dark time.
It sounds like it. So what changed? How did we get out of the Depression?
Well, that's when FDR comes in, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's elected in 1932.
Right.
And he brings in the New Deal, this whole set of programs to help people to get the economy going again.
Good.
And it works. I mean, it doesn't solve everything, but it gives people hope.
Yeah.
And then World War II starts, and FDR, he leads the country through that too.
He was president for a long time, wasn't he?
He was. He was elected 4 times.
Wow.
He's considered one of our greatest presidents. He had this ability to connect with people, to inspire them.
Yeah, he was a powerful speaker, wasn't he?
He was. His fireside chats on the radio, they were really popular. People felt like he was talking directly to them, reassuring them during those tough times.
Yeah, I could see how that would be comforting. It sounds like his presidency really changed things, right?
It did. He showed that the government could be a force for good, that it could help people in their everyday lives. And that idea, it's had a lasting impact on American politics. It really did. FDR, he changed the game. And, all the presidents who came after him, they had to deal with that legacy. Plus, the world was a whole different place after World War II. You have the Cold War starting up. It's this whole new kind of conflict. The threat of nuclear war is just hanging over everything.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine living with that kind of fear.
Yeah.
So how did guys like Truman and Eisenhower deal with all that? I mean, they had the Cold War, but they also had all this stuff happening at home, like the Civil Rights Movement. How did they handle it all?
Well, Truman, he had to make some tough choices right from the start. Dropping the atomic bombs on Japan, that was a huge decision.
Yeah.
And then, trying to help Europe rebuild after the war with the Marshall Plan.
And then desegregating the military?
Oh, yeah. That was a landmark moment for civil rights. I mean, Truman, he was dealing with, global issues, but he was also trying to address these deep-seated problems at home. It was a lot.
It sounds like every decision had these huge consequences. And then Eisenhower, he came in with this whole different perspective, right?
Yeah.
Being a general and all.
Yeah, Eisenhower, he was, steady, calm. People trusted him. He understood the danger of the Cold War.
Yeah.
But he really believed in diplomacy, trying to work things out peacefully, like with his Atoms for Peace program.
What was that?
He wanted to use nuclear energy for good, not for war.
That's interesting. It really shows how different personalities can approach the same problem in completely different ways.
Yeah.
Speaking of different personalities, JFK, I mean, he brought this, energy, this optimism to the White House.
Oh, absolutely. JFK, he was young, charismatic, he really connected with people.
Yeah.
But he had to deal with some really tense situations, like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, man. That must have been terrifying. The world was, on the edge of nuclear war.
It was. And, Kennedy, he kept his cool. He worked with Khrushchev, the Soviet leader.
And they managed to avoid war.
They did. It was a close call, but they found a way out.
It's amazing. It's so sad, though, that his presidency was cut short.
Yeah.
You wonder what he could accomplish if he'd had more time. And then Lyndon Johnson. He takes over after Kennedy's assassination. He's got Vietnam to deal with, plus all these big plans for social change.
Yeah, Johnson, he was a complex figure. I mean, his Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, they were huge. They helped millions of people. Right.
But then Vietnam, that just dragged on and on. It divided the country, It overshadowed all the good he did domestically.
It seems like presidents are always caught in this, tug of war between what they want to do at home and what's happening in the world, and trying to keep everyone happy. It's a tough job. Take Nixon, for example. He opens up relations with China, which is huge. But then you've got Watergate.
Yeah, Nixon, he was a tough one to figure out. Brilliant strategist, but also, paranoid.
Yeah.
He achieved a lot in foreign policy, but his own actions, his darker side, it brought him down in the end.
It's a good reminder that power can corrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. And that nobody's above the law.
So then you have Ford. He comes in after Nixon resigns. Talk about a tough situation to walk into. How did he handle it?
Well, he pardoned Nixon, which, a lot of people were angry about that. But Ford, he thought it was the best way to move the country forward.
Yeah. To put the Watergate scandal behind them and focus on the future. I mean, his presidency was short, but he had this focus on, integrity, bringing people together. Sometimes that's what you need most in a leader.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then Carter. He comes in with this whole, moral idealism.
Oh, yeah. Carter, he was all about human rights. He negotiated the Camp David Accords, bringing peace between Israel and Egypt.
That was a big deal.
It was. He really believed in diplomacy and doing what's right. But, he also had some tough times.
Like what?
The Iran hostage crisis, that was a big blow.
Yeah.
It kind of hurt his image, made people question his leadership.
It shows how hard it is, right? To balance your ideals with, the messy reality of politics.
Yeah.
And then you've got Reagan. He comes in with this, sunny optimism, this belief in America.
Yeah. Reagan, he was a transformative figure. He really shifted the political landscape. His economic policies, his tough stance on the Soviet Union, he changed the conversation.
And then George H.W. Bush, he kind of continued that legacy, didn't he?
He did. He oversaw the end of the Cold War, led the country through the first Gulf War. He was a steady hand, experienced, pragmatic.
And then Clinton. He seemed to bring, a new energy to the White House.
Yeah.
What were some of the big things he focused on?
Well, the economy was booming during his time. He worked on healthcare reform, tried to balance the budget. He was a really good communicator, connected with people.
Yeah, he did. And then George W. Bush. He takes office, and then, boom, 9/11 happens. It must have been, like, the most challenging time to be president.
It was. The war on terror, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was a defining period, not just for his presidency, but for the whole country. He also dealt with Hurricane Katrina. That was a major test of his leadership.
It's hard to imagine dealing with all that. And then Obama.
Yeah.
He breaks all these barriers, becomes the first black president. He brings this message of hope and change.
It was a historic moment. He had to deal with the economic crisis, the wars in the Middle East. He passed the Affordable Care Act, which was a huge accomplishment.
Yeah.
But he also faced a lot of opposition, a lot of division in the country.
It seems like that's always the challenge, right? Trying to unite people when there's so much disagreement. And then Trump. He really shook things up, didn't he?
He did. He was unlike any president we'd seen before. His policies, his style, his whole approach to the presidency, it was all very unconventional.
Yeah, it was. And it really divided people. Some loved him, some hated him. It was a very polarized time.
Yeah.
And finally, we get to Biden. He takes office at this really difficult time. You know, the pandemic's raging, the economy's a mess, and the country's still so divided.
Yeah, it's a lot to handle. He's trying to bring people together to heal those divisions, but it's a tough road. I mean, look, we've just gone through over 200 years of presidential history. It's amazing to see how much has changed, how much has stayed the same. O'Reilly's book, it really makes you think about, the kind of leaders we've had, the challenges they face.
It really does. So much for bestsellers in minutes. I mean, we barely scratched the surface. But it's been a great conversation.
It has. And it leaves us with some big questions, right? How do we judge these presidents? What can we learn from them? And how does their history help us understand what we're going through today?
Yeah, those are great questions to keep in mind. If you want to dive deeper into all this, definitely check out Confronting the Presidents. And until next time, keep reading, keep thinking. This is Bookkast, signing off.